So you finally did it. You got yourself a new baitcaster, and you're ready to spool some line. But wait, before you search YouTube and find out that some people tell you to take the line and put it back in the box and run it through and spool it that way, other instruction videos tell you to just leave it on the ground, spool it like that. And then you have the TikTok fishermen who say, put it under the lid, run that line through that steam hole. Stop. Don't do any of that, because I'm going to teach you how to do it the right way. And that's coming up on Live to Fish. Hey everybody, welcome back to Live to Fish. Today we're going to look at bait casters and how to spool line on them the proper way. Now, that's not to knock any of the other videos that are out there. They simply all have one thing in common. They all introduce the one thing that is detrimental to the line on your reel, and that one thing is abrasion. Now, abrasion comes in two forms. One is controlled and one is not controlled. The one that's controlled is on you, the end user. That means you have to make sure you spool your line properly, make sure you check the guides on your rods, and try to avoid anything that could compromise that line. Now, the non-controlled forms of abrasion come within the environment. Obviously, when you're casting into riprap, casting around cover, you're going to have natural abrasion to that line. And then there's the toothy critters, but that's a whole nother topic. But today, we're going to change that one factor that is in your control, and that's to make sure that there's no abrasion when you're setting the spool on your reel. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I don't really recommend leaving the line just as it is and spooling off of that. Now, what that means is you want that the same coiling or memory that is on this spool gets transferred over to your bait casting reel so that you avoid those springy lines and backlashes. And the other reason is our nemesis, abrasion. What you don't want is, as you're spooling, for that line to be rubbing around the outside or against that plastic on the spool. Now, this one's rather smooth, so it's not that big of a deal, but it's still abrasive. Now, here's another example of a very popular line and a very popular spool. You'll see that there's notches in it. Now, if you had this resting on the ground and you were actually spooling directly off of this and just letting that line run past those notches, you are definitely going to get abrasive lines probably every maybe 5 to 6 inches in that line. That's going to result in you getting some break-offs, and you're not going to be very happy. It's one thing to lose a fish, but if you're constantly losing lures because of abrasions on your line, not something you want. So again, I do not recommend just laying this on the ground and spooling it that way. Like I said, you will want to avoid abrasion at all costs when you're spooling your reel. And here's why I would definitely not recommend the TikTok version. For one, you have this spool in here getting knocked around, and that's causing abrasion on your line. But the big factor here is this eyelet right here. This is not a fishing rod eyelet. This is an eyelet for a lid for cooking that lets out steam. Guaranteed that is going to leave some abrasive marks on your line, and again, going to reduce that life expectancy by quite a bit. Like I said, there are some fancy devices that help you spool your reel, but here's something I'm going to show you. You can make at home with the stuff you already have. You should have a little box like this. I personally have a ton of these Carl's Bait and Tackle Shop boxes laying around, but feel free to use Amazon or whatever cardboard box makes you happy. The other thing you're going to need is you're going to need one of these, and this is a kebab steak. You should have some of these kebab steaks on hand. Heck, if you have a Carl's box around, you better have one of these for the barbecue. Okay, so with this steak here in this box, I'm going to show you how to make your own spooler. Make sure that your box has the flaps still attached, and make sure that they're in the down position here. Now, you're going to want to make sure you poke holes in the center of the box on either side of those flaps. So we're going to go ahead and poke our hole through here. Watch your fingers. Poke a hole through the other side. And I'm only going about maybe an inch down from the top. All right, then we're going to take the flap, fold it down, and we're going to run that steak through the hole on the one side and through to the other. And what you're going to see is these flaps here help hold that steak in place. What you don't want is that steak rolling around with the spool of line and really messing up what you're trying to do here. All right, so now I'm going to show you how to thread that line. You're going to want to go ahead and poke that through the center hole of that spool line. Run it on there. And you're going to want to make sure that that spool, that the line is coming up and over, not under. You want it up and over. Because running it up and over, it's going to follow the memory of that current spool. You want to transfer that current memory to the spool on your reel. The reason why you position it so high to the top of there, because you want to be able to see the top of that reel as you're spooling, and you also are going to have different size spools of line. You want to make sure you have enough surface area between your spooling reel and the box. So now we're ready to take that line and spool it onto our baitcaster. Now you'll see here I have two separate baitcasters, and the reason for that, you're going to notice they're going to come in two different styles. One is the spool is going to have these little holes inside the spool itself, And they may come in just a single roll like this, or they may come covering the entire reel. But these are very important, and I'm going to get to that in a second. Then you have the other type of bait casting spool. Now these spools are smooth, there's no holes, nothing to run the line through, and that's something that I'm going to explain how you can properly anchor this when you're spooling your reel. All right, one of the things I've talked about in previous videos is using a Q-tip to check the line guides in your rod for any potential abrasion items, cracked eyelets, that sort of thing. So now what you're going to want to do with your new Baitcaster is you're just going to want to take that Q-tip and just kind of run it into that line guide a little bit. And just take a look and see if it gets snagged up on anything. You're going to want to make sure that there's no chance of abrasion on that line going into the spool. This one checked out just fine. There's no fibers in there. Everything's good. Now, the second thing you're going to want to look for on the reel is specifications as to what type of line diameter or weight and what the total length of the line that it will accept on the spool is listed on the reel. My new 13 Fishing Origin R1 does not have the line recommendations on there, so I'm going to have to look that up online to get that. Now, for those other two reels, they're not printed on the reel itself, so I do have to go to the manufacturer's website and take a look at what the recommendations are. But for instance, on this PC Fun Phantom X, it has the line recommendations printed right on here. Now it has, for braid, it has 30-pound test at 130 yards. It has mono set at 10-pound test at 120 yards. Now what that is saying is basically that braid at 30-pound test, the diameter on that line will give you 120 yards on this spool. When it comes to mono, the 10-pound diameter will give you 120 yards as well. That gives you a baseline so that you know at these gauges how much line you can put on the spool. So the greater the diameter of the line, the heavier the line, the less you're going to be able to spool up on there, and the lighter, a little bit more. Now let's get to the spooling. Now for spooling the line on the reel, they have those fancy devices out there that are pretty much just the same as like the first third or quarter of your rod. So what you want to do is have the Baitcaster on the rod that you're pairing it up with, and you're going to want to go down the rod to the first eyelet. Now the first eyelet is where you're going to loop that line through before it goes through the line guide of the reel. But before you thread it through that eyelet, just do a quick check and make sure that there's no nicks or nothing that's going to leave abrasion on that line as you're running it through. For demonstrative purposes, I'm going to be using braided line just because it's easier to see for the video. And what you're going to do is you're going to want to thread that line through that first eyelet and then drag it down to the line guide of your reel. And it's going to go in there. But let me take this off of here to make it easier for you for demonstrative purposes. Now, I can't stress enough the importance of making sure that you run that line through the line guide before going to the spool. If you don't, as you spool your line, this is not going to run back and forth and spread or distribute the line evenly across the spool of your reel. Again, for demonstrative purposes, this would be on your reel and obviously through that first eyelet. So we're going to go ahead and run it through the line guide now and bring it back the other side. And we're going to bring just enough to go through, go around that spool, and create an overhand knot. Now here's a trick I'm going to show you that if you're having an issue with the spool inside the reel there, getting this line around and getting that knot tied, here's a little trick that you can actually take this spool out and make it a little bit easier, a little more accessible to get at that spool and create that knot. The first step to this trick is to make sure that you open up the access to the door here and get the spool off of the reel. We're going to go ahead and take that out. And you're going to want to thread your line back through that entry port. Now from here, we're going to wrap the line around the spool a couple of times. Again, this doesn't have any holes. This is the smooth spool. And we're going to go ahead and tie an overhand knot on this. Now with your knot in place, you want to make sure that that knot placement is right in the center of that spool. With most line, they're going to have a little piece of tape here that's included with each spool. You're going to want to take that piece of tape, or maybe even a little piece of electrical tape, Scotch tape, whatever you have, and put it right on top of that knot to hold it in place on the spool. So with the tape in place, we're going to go ahead and cut the tag line so that it's not in the way. And again, braided line's a little bit more difficult to cut. Just got to give it a little bit more effort. Now that that's done, we're going to go ahead and we're going to put that spool back through that faceplate area. Going to line it back up and get it back in. And now you see the line is on the spool through that guide, and we're going to go ahead and replace our door. Okay, door's in place, spool's on, line's on. Make sure it's through that guide hole. We're all set to start spooling. So here we have the homemade spooling setup all ready to go. We have the main spool line here, and it's on that kebab steak through the box, and there's no obstructions here, and it's not going to cause any abrasion. It's running from the top, so we're going to avoid that line twist coming from this spool. It now comes off of the top, again, running off the top through that first guide on the rod and through the guide on the reel itself. And again, this is spooled with 30-pound braid just for demonstrative purposes. And while we're on the topic of braided line, what I want to do is I want to go over something real quick, and that's called a backing line. Okay, so let's talk about the backing line. And first I'm going to present it on this other bait casting reel here. This is one that has the holes in the spool. Now this, you're going to take your line and thread it through the guide, and you're going to come in and you're going to run it through the holes in the spool itself, run it back out, do an overhand knot on it. Now it's actually tied to the spool, not just running around the spool. What that's going to do is it's going to obviously link itself or anchor itself to the spool itself. Now when that becomes important is when you're using braided line and spooling that onto a reel. Braided line is going to have a tendency to slide on that reel if you don't have the holes in here, if it's not anchored properly. So if you're using braided line on a smooth spool, that means one without the holes, you're definitely going to have something to anchor it. You're going to have either a dab of tape to stick on there, or you're going to run what's called backing line. And backing line is just taking some cheap monofilament and making sure that the monofilament runs along the spool just to cover it, and then you're going to attach that, like you would with a leader, to the braided line. So the backing line is essentially the reverse of a leader. Basically, it's going to be the leader end that is going to be on this spool, say some cheap monofilament, that's going to cover up this spool just so you can't see it anymore, and then you're going to attach your braided line to it. Now, when people use high-end, say, fluorocarbon line, they're going to do the same thing. They're going to put on some cheap monofilament on here as a backing line, and they're going to fill that spool up a little bit first so that you're not putting all that expensive line and filling up the full 120 yards or whatever the specifications are for the reel you're using. So that's the long and short of it on the backing line. Let's get to reeling. Okay, so now we're ready to go ahead and spool some line. The one thing I want to tell you is to make sure you have your drag set up tight so that the little bit of tension that you put on with your fingers with this line, it doesn't interfere with it, and you're still able to get that line to go on that spool. So as you can see, I'm going to set my fingers up halfway between that first eyelet that I ran that line through and the reel. And now I'm going to begin ever so slowly reeling in, and you'll see that line coming off the spool, coming off the top. No abrasion, it's not rubbing up against the spool, it's not rubbing up against the box, it's only going through that eyelet. And again, I have the stake going through the flap, so it's holding that stake in place, so it's not moving that stake as it's turning. So if you did everything correctly, you can see now, watch that eyelet, see how it runs that line back and forth across that spool evenly. It's distributed evenly, and there's no high spots or low spots within that spool. So continue spooling up that reel until you get about anywhere between about 1/8 or 1/16 of an inch up to the edge or the lip of that beveled edge on that spool, and then you know you have enough line. Personally, I like to go about 1/8 of an inch because I find the more line that I have on there, the more prone I am to backlashes, and nobody likes those. Would I recommend going to about 1/16 or 1/8 of an inch from the top of the spool with your line? Now, this is a good example of a spool that does not have enough line on it. I would say probably maybe the halfway point or a little bit more on that spool, and it'll be perfect. Now, by comparison, here is a reel that has a little bit too much braided line on it. Again, that's just probably shy of 1/16 of an inch. But if you can see the darkness or the color change between the edge or the side of the spool versus the actual facing of the spool inside, you can see the black line and then the red line there. If you can see the gap there, I think you're pretty good. If you can't see the gap there, that's way too much line. Pull some of that off. Well, I hope you got some use out of this video on how to spool your baitcaster. If you did like the video, please don't forget to hit that like. Don't forget to subscribe to Live to Fish, and do me a favor. Share this video with friends and family that may be having some issues and could get some help out of this. So until next time, spool up, stay safe and be well, and as always, live to fish. Take care, everybody.